in a way that detracts from the historical confidence and professionalism of all your agencies. But I'm concerned, obviously, about the numbers we have in our staff report that the increase in fatalities and traffic accidents in the United States from NHTSA, Mr. Danielson, increased so dramatically from 2014 2015. Over 35,000 Americans lost their lives, one every 15 minutes. This was the largest increase over a one-year period in 50 years of record keeping. And then the Center for Disease Control, their research showing that we are an outlier in that regard when we look at other countries. So my question is in context of that historically you've all done a good job, but the urgency of a world that's changing so rapidly and your ability to adapt to that. So I'm going to bring three incidents areas just as an illustration and want you to respond to it. First, in procurement, I had a constituent die on Highway 101 in Marin County in Northern California some years ago, and he fell asleep and ran into a guardrail that had been approved by NHTSA, built by Trinity Industries. There's subsequently a New York Times story about a year ago about over $100 million judgment against Trinity. The ABC affiliate in San Francisco found out that Caltrans had literally thousands of these modified guardrails that were dangerous to the public and turned out to be involved in fatalities around the country, litigation against the Department of Transportation, Texas, Virginia. And my response when I was looking at this in the legislature was from the Secretary of Transportation, a great professional in the Brown administration, the director of Caltrans, was they relied on NHTSA and you had approved this and you hadn't responded to it. So I bring that in the context of the urgency for you to respond to situations like this and the confidence that is important for the public and states to have in you because they do. And then, so it's more illustrative of the story of your ability to adapt. And the other two areas, one of which has been brought up here extensively about marijuana and the increased use. CRS, I have a constituent, Philip Drum, who, because his sister died in an accident that was attributed to someone who was abusing marijuana, and the other vehicles made it his cause to come here and around the country. But in research we've gotten from CRS because of his questions is that several studies have shown that THS in people's blood was roughly twice as likely to be responsible for deadly crashes than drugs or alcohol, other drugs or alcohol. So the ability for you to respond to that in a world where states are approving, Colorado, now California, the legalization of marijuana, I think is particularly important, and the perception that people rely on NHTSA to be responsive. So how you can do that and Congress can. And lastly, in the area of technology, having dealt with Apple and other providers, it's my belief that technology exists right now, and there's been a story, at least in Money magazine, that Apple believes in their next platform they'll have technology so that you can shut down phones when there's movement in a car so that they can't receive. And so the issue of distraction could be inhibited quite a bit. There's currently technology, but it requires a Federal Communication Commission waiver that for less than $30 you can put a device in the car so a parent could, and it could intercept any kind of transmissions either coming in or out of the car. So those three instances are just illustrative to me of the urgency and the confidence that the public and states need, and the private sector, that you have the ability to respond quickly. And the urgency is particularly acute because if we're an outlier, there are lives at risk, not to indulge in hyperbole. So what is it that you think you need from us to be able to be more responsive or to communicate more clearly to states that there's a danger involved, a prospective danger while you do your due diligence to legalizing marijuana? There's a danger involved if we don't get on top of distracted driving, and there may be technology, so how can we prod Apple and Samsung to get us that technology sooner rather than later?
Sir, you raise a lot of really important points, particularly about behavioral safety. The one thing, your point on 2015 and the largest rate increase in 50 years is right on, and that's a source of major concern. Historically, I'd just like to, broaden our aperture just a little bit. If you go back those 50 years and look at our fatality rate at that time, today we're 1/5 where we were 50 years ago. So vehicles are safer, roadways are safer, and the work of...
Mr. Danielson, I don't mean to interrupt you, but the first comments I made were meant to address that. So we've done really good work, but we've got this anomaly right now that I think we have to have a sense of urgency about correcting.
I'd like...
So I acknowledge what we've done.
Okay. I'd like to defer to my colleague at Federal Highway on the first issue of the guardrails, and then I can address your second and third issue.
Let me see if I can address guardrails very quickly. Roadside hardware, there are standards for roadside hardware, and they have improved over the years. Our current standard is MASH, Manual and Assessing Safety Hardware. It's an AASHTO standard. It was just recently adopted. The previous one was NCHRP 350. Roadside hardware is tested to those standards. That's like the laboratory test. I hate to say it and call it that way, but it's a controlled test. When that test is passed, and we at Federal Highway review those test results to ensure that it passes that, states will use that roadside hardware out if they choose. You also have to assess in-service performance, maintenance, and construction practices that go along with this, which may vary from state to state. We do, when it comes to guardrail end terminals, which is the one you have brought up, we do have an in-service pilot on that, with 5 states currently involved with that. And what we have found from reviewing those end terminals, that there's really none of those end terminals are better or worse than the others. So our program is fact-based and data-driven and performance-based, and without that data showing us that these truly are dangerous or more dangerous than what else is out there, we would not pull those particular devices.
So, Mr. Danielson, the chair is indulging me. I appreciate those comments, although we can engage in further conversation outside of my limited time.
Okay. On marijuana, as you mentioned, you have a number of states that are legalizing marijuana. From 2007 to 2014, we saw a 50% increase in usage. And we know that marijuana impairs judgment and impairs driving ability, particularly with reaction time. And so our research is geared to try and establish a baseline threshold where we can establish impairment. Because right now we don't have a scientifically acceptable threshold for impairment of marijuana. And the other technological challenge associated with that is the detection of impairment. Even once we have that, do we have the technology to test either oral fluids or other biometric features to establish impairment by law enforcement officials? Right now, NHTSA uses the Drug Recognition Expert Program, where we train about 8,000 law enforcement officials on a battery of tests to basically, because different drugs have different effects, to basically establish impairment by various drugs. These are court-accepted procedures, but it's very complicated. It takes a lot of time to train law enforcement. They're very important, but having a device would be very important. On distraction, as you mentioned, just recently there was several press reports about...
We'll have to ask that we, but we can have a second round of question, okay, if you care to stay for that. So just got to be fair. Okay, thank you for... I'll recognize now Mr. Faso.